under my fingernails, a cheap polyester suit clinging to my sweat, and the sudden weight of 3,000 acres. I buried my brother today. When I got back to the house, my son tried to put me in a home. That's when I decided to let him ruin himself. Rain doesn't wash away grief. It just makes it smell like mud. Wyatt's funeral was a sparse affair. He was a man who preferred the company of soybeans and rusted tractors to people, and the turnout reflected that. A half-dozen neighboring farmers, the local feed store owner, and me. That was it. The canvas canopy over the burial plot flapped in the wind, a sharp snapping sound that cut through the monotonous drone of the pastor's recycled eulogy. I stood at the edge of the hole. The dirt piled next to it was dark, rich, and heavy. It smelled of worms and crushed grass and a century of our family sweating into it. Wyatt got the land. I got a degree in accounting, a house in the suburbs that I eventually lost to medical bills when my wife died, and a one-way ticket to my son's basement. I watched the brass-handled box lower into the earth. The winch groaned, metal rubbing against metal. It was an ugly sound. I rubbed my thumb over the pad of my index finger, feeling a calloused ridge there. I hadn't touched a plow in 40 years, but the memory of the vibration still lived in my bones. I was exhausted. My knees ached from standing, and my jaw throbbed from clenching it for 3 days straight. After the cemetery, there was the lawyer, Mr. Gable. His office smelled of stale coffee and lemon pledge that couldn't quite mask the scent of decaying paper. "He left it all to you, Harrison," Gable said. He slid a thick manila folder across the scratched mahogany desk. The paper made a dry, rasping sound against the wood. The home place, the river bottom tract, and the new parcel he bought up near the county line off the Miller estate. Free and clear, 3 farms, upwards of 3,000 acres of prime, tillable soil. I didn't speak right away. I just stared at the folder. Wyatt and I hadn't spoken more than 10 words a year since our father died. He thought I was a soft suburbanite. I thought he was a stubborn relic, but he didn't leave it to the church. He didn't leave it to a conservation trust. He left it to me. "Taxes," I croaked. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. "Paid up," Gable replied, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Wyatt was cash poor on paper, but he hoarded every dime he ever made. "There's a trust account that covers the property taxes for the next 5 years. After that, well, land prices being what they are, you could sell a fraction of an acre and pay the county for a decade." I walked out of Gable's office into the gray afternoon, the folder heavy under my arm. The drive back to my son's house took an hour. The rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers was hypnotizing. I felt nothing like a wealthy man. I just felt like an old one. My son Bradley lived in a sterile, aggressively modern subdivision where the trees were all exactly 6 feet tall and the houses were painted in varying shades of acceptable depression. Slate, charcoal, and beige. I parked my 10-year-old sedan in the driveway, careful not to let the tires touch the pristine grass. When I opened the front door, the smell hit me. Not the rich, heavy smell of Wyatt's dirt, but the sharp, synthetic bite of Megan's favorite room spray. White tea and ozone, or something equally ridiculous. It smelled like a hospital trying to disguise itself as a spa. "Wipe your shoes, Dad." Bradley's voice drifted from the kitchen. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how the funeral went. Just a command. I looked down at my dress shoes. There was a smear of graveyard mud on the heel. I scuffed it off on the bristled mat, feeling a sudden, intense spike of bile in the back of my throat. Dinner was a quiet, tense affair. It usually was. We sat around the massive granite island in the kitchen. Megan had prepared steamed white fish, a pile of unseasoned quinoa, and asparagus that tasted like water. The silverware scraped against the porcelain plates. It was the only sound in the room besides the hum of the oversized refrigerator. I chewed my fish. It had the texture of wet cotton. Bradley sat across from me, scrolling through his phone. He had my nose, but that was where the resemblance ended. He was polished, manicured, and ruthless in a corporate, bloodless kind of way. Megan sat next to him, sipping a glass of aggressively expensive red wine. She wore a silk blouse that looked like it cost more than my first car. She looked at me the way one might look at a stray dog that had wandered onto the patio, annoyed, mildly disgusted, and wondering who to call to have it removed. "So," Bradley said, not looking up from his screen, "the funeral, it's done." "Yes," I said. "It's done." "Good." He tapped a few times, then set the phone face down. He leaned forward, folding his hands together. It was his management posture. I'd seen him use it when he was practicing firing people over Zoom. "Listen, Dad. Megan and I have been talking." Megan nodded solemnly, taking another sip of wine. The glass left a faint, red ring on her lips. "It's about your living situation, Harrison. We know you've been struggling down in the basement." The basement was fine. It smelled mildly of damp drywall and the hot water heater hummed a little too loud, but it was mine. Or, rather, it was the only place I had left. "I'm not struggling," I said softly. "Dad, let's be realistic," Bradley interrupted, his tone patronizingly gentle. "You're getting older. The stairs are a hazard. And frankly, Megan is pregnant." I blinked. "Pregnant? We're going to need the space," Megan chimed in, her voice tight and defensive. "For a nanny suite. The basement is the only logical place to put it." Bradley reached into his leather briefcase resting on the stool beside him and pulled out a glossy, trifold brochure. He slid it across the cold granite. It stopped right next to my plate of cold fish. "Shady Pines Assisted Living. Dignity in your twilight." "It's a very nice facility," Megan said quickly. "They have a bridge club, and we'd pay the first 3 months' deposit. After that, your Social Security should cover a shared room." A shared room at Shady Pines. I knew the place. It was a warehouse for the dying, smelling constantly of boiled cabbage and industrial bleach. They wanted to throw me away so they could have a live-in nanny. I looked at the brochure. I looked at Bradley's perfectly styled hair and Megan's anxious, impatient eyes. I felt a slow, dark warmth bloom in my chest. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was clarity. For 3 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into the corners of their lives. I had spoken softly, eaten their terrible food, and apologized for taking up oxygen. I picked up my water glass. Condensation dripped down the side, wetting my fingers. I took a slow sip. "I won't be going to Shady Pines," I said. My voice was suddenly steady, resonant. Bradley sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Dad, don't make this difficult. You don't have the assets to afford anything else, and we can't subsidize your retirement. You know the market is volatile right now." "I don't need you to subsidize anything," I said. I set the glass down. It made a sharp clack against the stone. "I went to Mr. Gable's office after the cemetery." Bradley frowned. "Who?" "Wyatt's lawyer." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the manila folder. I didn't open it. I just rested my hand on top of the worn paper. Wyatt didn't have much liquid cash, but he never sold an inch of the family land. He bought more, actually. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the distant hallway. "I just inherited 3 farms," I said. I kept my voice flat, conversational. 3,200 acres of prime agricultural real estate in the valley. 0 debt. Taxes paid. Megan's wineglass stopped halfway to her mouth. Bradley stared at me. The annoyance on his face fractured, replaced by a blank, buffering confusion. 3,000 acres, I confirmed. I watched his eyes dart from the folder to my face. I watched the math happen in his head. He worked in commercial real estate financing. He knew exactly what tillable acreage in that county went for. 10,000 an acre on the low end, 15 on the high. I was sitting on $40 million. The silence stretched. It was thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I could smell the faint scent of fear sweating out of Bradley's pores, cutting right through Megan's white tea room spray. "Dad," Bradley breathed. His voice was suddenly an octave lower, stripped of all the management polish. It was the voice of a little boy who had just seen a ghost. Megan set her wine glass down so fast it nearly tipped over. She swallowed hard. Harrison, my God, we had no idea. We're so sorry for your loss. Wyatt was a wonderful man. She had met Wyatt exactly once. She had called him a hillbilly the entire ride home. He was a stubborn son of a bitch. I corrected her gently. I picked up the brochure for Shady Pines and folded it in half, then in half again, until it was a thick, useless square of glossy paper. I slipped it into my pocket, but he left me a hell of a problem to manage. All that land, the leasing contracts, the equipment auctions. I don't know the first thing about managing an estate of this size. I looked at my son. The hook was baited. I just needed to see if he would bite. Well, Bradley said, clearing his throat. He sat up straighter, a manic, hungry light suddenly burning in his eyes. You don't have to do it alone, Dad. That's what family is for. I smiled. It didn't reach my eyes. Thank you, Bradley. I appreciate that. The transformation over the next week was nothing short of grotesque. I woke up the morning after the dinner to the smell of brewing coffee. Real coffee. Not the cheap instant grounds I usually drank in the basement, but the rich, oily, single-origin beans Bradley kept hoarded in his pantry. When I came upstairs, Megan was standing by the stove. She was wearing a floral apron over her designer clothes. "Morning, Harrison," she sang out. Her voice was unnervingly bright. It reminded me of glass shattering. "I'm making a tart, pear, and Gruyere. I thought you might want a proper breakfast." I sat at the island. The kitchen smelled of scorched sugar. She had clearly burned the first batch of something and was desperately trying to cover it up with ventilation. "Thank you, Megan." Bradley bounded into the room a few minutes later. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was wearing an expensive, rugged-looking flannel shirt, the kind a man buys when he wants to play at being a lumberjack on the weekends. "Morning, Dad," he said, slapping me lightly on the shoulder. He set a thick, leather-bound notebook on the counter. I took the day off. Thought we could go over the estate papers. I stayed up late looking into the county zoning maps. "Did you know the north parcel borders the new highway expansion?" "Does it?" I said, taking a sip of the perfect bitter coffee. I played dumb. I let my shoulders slump, letting my voice waver, just a fraction to sound overwhelmed. "I don't know, Brad. It's just so much paper. Gable gave me a headache. I was just going to lease it to the Jensens down the road for whatever they offered." Bradley's eyes widened in horror. "Dad, no. No, you can't do that. The Jensens will fleece you. You're sitting on a generational asset. We need to maximize the yield. Hell, if we rezone that north parcel for commercial development, we could triple the value." We. There it was, the magical pronoun. Commercial development. I rubbed my temples, pretending to look exhausted. "I don't know anything about that. I'm just an old accountant. And with the baby coming, I don't want to be a burden on you two." Megan practically sprinted across the kitchen, placing a delicate porcelain plate with a slice of tart in front of me. "Oh, Harrison, stop it. You are never a burden. That silly nursing home talk was just hormones. Pregnancy brain. We want you here." "Absolutely," Bradley agreed. He opened his notebook. It was filled with frantic, color-coded graphs. "Look, Dad, I can handle the heavy lifting. I know real estate. I know the tax loopholes. I can set up an LLC, transfer the deeds, and act as your managing partner. You won't have to lift a finger." I looked at his manicured hands, tapping eagerly against the granite. He was already spending the money in his head. "I don't know," I sighed, cutting into the tart. The pears were undercooked, but I chewed them slowly, forcing them down. Transferring deeds. That sounds complicated and expensive. I don't have the cash to pay for the lawyers and the filing fees, let alone start rezoning. Bradley waved a hand dismissively. "Don't worry about the liquidity. I confront the operational costs. We're talking about pennies compared to the ROI. "Are you sure?" I asked, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "I wouldn't want you dipping into your savings." "Dad, please. It's an investment," Bradley scoffed. He leaned in closer. "Actually, I was thinking. The old farmhouse on the home place. Is it livable? Wyatt lived in it, I said. Needs work. Roof leaks in the kitchen. Plumbing rattles. Perfect, Bradley said. We can renovate it. Gut it down to the studs. Turn it into a real country estate. It'll be our family anchor. Megan and I could even move out there once the baby is born. The air is cleaner. Megan's smile flickered for a fraction of a second at the thought of moving to a farm, but her greed quickly glued it back into place. It sounds idyllic, she lied. Renovations cost money, Bradley, I warned gently. I have equity, Bradley said confidently. I can take out a bridge loan against this house. Once we sell off the first 50 acres of the highway parcel, I'll pay it off in one fell swoop. It's perfectly safe leverage. I set my fork down. The metallic click echoed in the quiet kitchen. He was going to borrow against his own home, the home he loved more than anything, to renovate a farmhouse he didn't own, on land he had no legal right to, all based on the assumption that I would sign it over to him. If you think that's best, I said softly. Trust me, Dad, Bradley said, patting my hand. His skin was warm and slightly clammy. I'm going to take care of everything. I know you will, I replied, looking right into his eyes. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched my son construct his own gallows. He hired architects to draw up plans for the farmhouse. The blueprints were massive wraparound porches, a professional chef's kitchen, a 4-car garage. They smelled of fresh ink and arrogance. He didn't just take out a bridge loan. He maxed out his equity line of credit. I saw the bank statements lying carelessly on his home office desk. He was pulling out hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay retainers for high-end zoning lawyers, surveyors, and the down payment for the contractor who was going to gut Wyatt's house. Megan, meanwhile, started spending in anticipation of her new status as a country estate owner. Packages arrived daily. Expensive linen riding clothes, even though she had never been near a horse. Antique rustic decor that smelled of dust and price gouging. A brand new luxury SUV with 4-wheel drive that would never touch anything rougher than a gravel driveway. They were bleeding themselves dry, intoxicated by the phantom millions dancing just out of reach. And all the while, they treated me like a king. I was moved out of the basement into the guest room upstairs. Megan bought me expensive cashmere sweaters that made me itch. Bradley poured me $200 scotch every evening. But I noticed the subtle things. The way Bradley's foot bounced nervously when the contractors demanded more money up front. The tight, strained lines around Megan's mouth when she looked at the growing pile of credit card bills. They were overextended, balancing on a razor's edge of debt, waiting for me to sign the final papers to form the LLC and transfer the land. Mr. Gable had drafted the papers. They sat in a pristine leather folder on Bradley's desk, waiting for my signature. One evening, I walked out to the backyard. The air was cool, smelling of cut grass and exhaust fumes from the nearby highway. Bradley came out a moment later, holding 2 crystal glasses of scotch. Here you go, Dad, he said, handing me a glass. The ice clinked against the sides. Contractors start demolition on the farmhouse next week. It's going to be spectacular. I took a sip of the scotch. It burned my throat in a pleasant way. You've put a lot of work into this, Bradley. I told you I would, he said, smiling. It was a tight smile, stretched thin by the stress of his hidden debts. By the way, Gable said the LLC papers are ready. If we can get those signed tomorrow, I can finalize the rezoning application on Monday. I stared into the amber liquid in my glass. The trap was fully set. The jaws were open, and Bradley had his head resting right on the pressure plate. Tomorrow, I agreed softly. We'll take care of it tomorrow. The morning sun looked washed out, bleeding a pale, sickly light over the suburban rooftops. Bradley insisted on driving us to Mr. Gable's office in Megan's new SUV. The interior smelled aggressively of fresh, off-gassing leather and the faint, chemical pine of a detailing spray. It was a sterile, isolated environment, completely disconnected from the humid, heavy air pressing against the tinted windows. Bradley drove with both hands gripping the thick steering wheel, his knuckles a tight, bloodless white. He was wearing a navy suit that fit him with predatory precision. He kept adjusting the knot of his silk tie, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. I sat in the passenger seat, wearing the same cheap, slightly frayed polyester jacket I had worn to Wyatt's funeral. The fabric scratched against my wrists. I watched the houses blur past, identical boxes of manicured lawns in silent desperation. The contractor said the demolition permits for the old farmhouse will be approved by Thursday, Bradley said, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. I had to grease a few palms at the county clerk's office, expedite the processing fee, but it's worth it. Once we bulldoze that rotting structure, we can lay the foundation for the new estate. Megan is already picking out the marble for the kitchen island. She wants Carrera. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound in his throat. It wasn't a sound of affection. It was the sound of a man trying to convince himself everything was under control. He tapped his index finger against the leather steering wheel. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm was erratic. He was bleeding cash, floating on a bridge loan secured against his own roof, and he needed my signature like a drowning man needs a lifeline. I looked at the side of his face. He looked so much like his mother right then, around the jawline, but the desperate, hungry look in his eyes was entirely his own creation. Carrera marble is heavy, I said quietly. Hard to maintain. Stains easily. Bradley waved a hand dismissively. We'll hire people to maintain it, Dad. That's the beauty of this level of wealth. You don't manage the problems. You just pay someone else to wipe them away. I nodded slowly, looking back out the window. The suburban sprawl was giving way to older commercial strips, pawn shops, discount tire centers, fading brick facades. We were getting closer to the city center, closer to Gable's office. My stomach was a knot of cold, heavy iron. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt an overwhelming, crushing sense of gravity. Mr. Gable's waiting room had not improved since my last visit. It still smelled of old dust, stale coffee grounds, and lemon floor wax. The receptionist, a woman with tired eyes and a loose floral blouse, typed methodically on a keyboard that clacked with hollow plastic finality. We sat on a sagging leather sofa that sighed loudly under our combined weight. The air conditioning unit in the window rattled, blowing a stream of lukewarm air against my neck. Bradley could not sit still. His leg bounced up and down, a rapid piston-like motion that shook the floorboards. He pulled his phone from his pocket, checked the blank screen, and shoved it back in. He checked his heavy stainless steel watch. 10 minutes late, he muttered, his voice dropping to an irritated whisper. You'd think for an estate of this magnitude, he'd have the decency to be punctual. I didn't point out that the appointment was for 10 o'clock and it was currently 9:58. Bradley was operating on a delayed fuse. The massive debt he had taken on over the last 3 weeks was a physical weight on his shoulders, pressing him down, making him twitchy and volatile. He had bet everything on a hand he hadn't even seen yet. I rested my hands on my knees. The coarse fabric of my trousers rubbed against my calloused skin. I thought about the basement back at Bradley's house. I thought about the water heater humming in the dark, the smell of damp concrete, and the glossy trifold brochure. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. My fingers brushed against the folded square of paper. It was still there. The sharp corners of the heavy cardstock dug into my fingertips. Mr. Gable will see you now, the receptionist said, her voice devoid of any inflection. Bradley practically launched himself off the sofa. He smoothed his jacket, took a deep breath, and strode toward the heavy oak door. I followed slowly, feeling the ache in my knees. Gable was sitting behind his desk, surrounded by leaning towers of manila folders. The room was dim, lit only by a brass desk lamp with a green glass shade. The light cast harsh, geometric shadows across the papers scattered over the scratched wood. Harrison, Gable said, standing up. He offered a firm, dry handshake. And this must be your son. Bradley, my son said, projecting his corporate voice. It was loud and polished, bouncing off the walls of the cramped office. He gripped Gable's hand and pumped it twice. Glad to finally meet you. I've been reviewing the LLC formation documents you sent over. They look solid. Standard pass-through entity. Limited liability for the managing members. I just have a few minor amendments regarding the distribution of voting shares once the commercial rezoning is approved. Gable adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking from Bradley to me. He looked genuinely confused. Voting shares? Rezoning? He picked up a blue ballpoint pen and tapped it against a legal pad. The sound was sharp. Harrison, I'm not entirely sure what your son is talking about. Bradley let out a short, patronizing laugh. The development plan, Mr. Gable. The new estate structure. Dad and I have been over this. We're forming the LLC today to transfer the title of the 3 farms, giving me managing authority so I can handle the contractors and the county zoning board. The paperwork should be right there. Bradley pointed to a thick, black leather folder resting on the edge of the desk. He had brought it with him. He unzipped it with a loud, metallic rasp and slid a thick stack of pristine white paper toward me. He uncapped a heavy, expensive silver pen and placed it precisely on top of the signature line. Sign here, Dad, and initial the next 3 pages. Then we can get this notarized and get out of Mr. Gable's hair. The room went completely silent. The only sound was the distant wail of a police siren, muffled by the dirty window glass. I looked down at the documents. They were perfectly typed, flawlessly formatted. They represented the complete and total surrender of my remaining autonomy. They represented millions of dollars, stripped from the earth and funneled into Carrera marble in 4-car garages. I looked at the silver pen. I didn't touch it. Bradley, I said softly. My voice felt rough, like a rusted hinge. You didn't need to print all this. Bradley smiled, but his eyes were darting rapidly. The corners of his mouth twitched. It's no problem, Dad. Better to have physical copies. Just sign. We have the architect meeting at noon. I reached into my inner jacket pocket. I pulled out the folded, glossy brochure for Shady Pines Assisted Living. I placed it gently on top of the LLC documents, right over the signature line. Bradley stared at the brochure. A single bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, catching the green light from the desk lamp. What is this? That's the brochure you gave me, I said, my tone perfectly flat, for the shared room. With the boiled cabbage. Bradley swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. Dad, we talked about this. That was a mistake. Hormones. We want you with us. In the new farmhouse. The estate. Remember? I remember, I said. I looked up at Gable. Mr. Gable, did you receive the faxes from the Jensen's lawyer this morning? Gable nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. The leather creaked loudly. I did, Harrison. Time-stamped at 8:15 a.m. Bradley's head snapped toward Gable. What faxes? Who are the Jensens? Our neighbors out in the valley, I said, looking back at my son. They've been farming the land adjacent to Wyatt's for 3 generations. Good people. They know the dirt. They know the rainfall. Dad, what are you talking about? Bradley's voice was rising in pitch. The corporate polish was fracturing, revealing the terrified, over-leveraged boy underneath. Sign the paper. The contractors need the down payment clearance. I can't sign your paper, Bradley, I said. I picked up his heavy silver pen and placed it back in his hand. His skin was ice cold. Because I don't own the functional rights to the land anymore. Bradley stopped breathing. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. At 8 o'clock this morning, I explained, speaking slowly, deliberately articulating every word. I signed a 99-year, irrevocable agricultural lease with the Jensen family. They have exclusive rights to farm all 3,000 acres for the next century. No, Bradley whispered. No, you couldn't have. Furthermore, Gable interjected, picking up a piece of paper from his desk, his voice completely dry and professional. Your father also finalized a conservation easement with the State Department of Natural Resources in exchange for a substantial fixed annual annuity paid directly into an inaccessible trust for your father's care. The 3 farms can never be subdivided, paved, or commercially developed. The land must remain agricultural in perpetuity. Any structures on the property, including the old farmhouse, are protected under a heritage clause and cannot be demolished. Bradley stumbled backward. His hip hit the edge of a heavy filing cabinet with a dull thud. He didn't seem to feel it. His face was the color of old ash. The veins in his neck were standing out, rigid and blue. But the rezoning, the highway parcel, the commercial developers. It's dirt, Bradley, I said quietly. It's just dirt, and it's going to stay dirt. I took out a loan, Bradley suddenly screamed. The sound tore from his throat, harsh and jagged, echoing violently in the small room. He slammed his hands down on Gable's desk, rattling the lamp. I maxed out the equity. The architect, the lawyers, the contractors. They want $200,000 by Friday. I secured it against my house. My house, Dad. Megan's car. Everything. I looked at him. I watched him shatter. I felt a deep, hollow ache in my ribs, a profound sadness that tasted like copper in the back of my mouth. He was my son. I had raised him. I had watched him take his first steps, and I had just let him walk right off a cliff. But I didn't push him. I just let him follow his own greed into the abyss. You told me you could handle the operational costs, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You said it was perfectly safe leverage. The drive back was an exercise in suffocating silence. Bradley didn't speak. He drove erratically, his breathing shallow and rapid. The SUV smelled of his sour, panicked sweat. He ran a red light, staring blindly ahead, his jaw locked in a rictus of sheer terror. The financial math was running through his head, an endless loop of compound interest, bridge loan penalty clauses, and negative equity. He was ruined, utterly, completely ruined. When we pulled into his pristine driveway, he didn't even put the car in park properly. It lurched forward, the tires brutally gouging the immaculate, emerald green grass he was so obsessive about. Megan came out of the front door before we even reached the porch. She was wearing a new flowing linen dress that belonged on a yacht, not in a suburb. She had a tablet in her hand, her eyes bright with a manic consumerist joy. Brad, the interior designer, just sent the renderings for the farmhouse kitchen. Wait until you see the copper range. She stopped. She looked at Bradley's face. The joy drained out of her expression instantly, replaced by a sharp, instinctive dread. She lowered the tablet. The silence stretched between them, heavy and pregnant with disaster. Bradley, she asked, her voice trembling slightly. What happened? Did he sign it? Bradley walked past her without a word. He didn't look at her. He pushed the heavy front door open and disappeared into the sterile, ozone-scented house. Megan stood frozen on the porch. She looked at me. Her pale blue eyes were wide, searching my face for an answer she didn't want to hear. Harrison, she whispered. There is no farmhouse, Megan, I said gently. I felt exhausted. The adrenaline had faded, leaving me with nothing but tired bones and a headache blooming behind my eyes. There is no estate. You need to call your credit card companies and start returning the packages. I walked past her and went straight down to the basement. The basement smelled exactly the same. Damp drywall, old dust, the metallic hum of the water heater. It was dark and cramped, but it was honest. I pulled my cheap, scuffed vinyl suitcase out from under the narrow cot. The zipper teeth caught halfway around, requiring a hard yank to break free. The sound was loud in the quiet basement. I didn't have much to pack. 4 shirts, 3 pairs of trousers, a shaving kit, and a pair of sturdy leather boots I hadn't worn in years. I folded the clothes methodically, pressing the fabric down to force the air out. Upstairs, the screaming began. It was muffled by the floorboards, but the violence of it was unmistakable. Megan's voice was a high, piercing shriek of pure hysteria, shattering the carefully constructed illusion of their perfect marriage. Bradley was yelling back, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of his usual controlled, corporate cadence. They were tearing each other apart, stripping away the luxury cars and the expensive wine to reveal the rotting foundation of debt and entitlement they had built their lives upon. A heavy object shattered against the hardwood floor above me. Glass rained down somewhere in the kitchen. I zipped the suitcase. I put on my old frayed jacket. I took a slow, deep breath of the basement air. I had lived in this dark corner for 3 years, shrinking myself, apologizing for existing, waiting for them to finally discard me. I picked up the suitcase by its cracked plastic handle. It was light. I walked up the wooden stairs. The kitchen was a war zone of scattered papers, overturned bar stools, and broken wine glasses. Bradley was sitting on the floor, his back against the granite island, his head buried in his hands, pulling violently at his perfectly styled hair. Megan was pacing in front of the window, weeping aggressively, screaming into her cell phone at someone about canceling an order. Neither of them looked at me. They were entirely consumed by the black hole of their own making. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the humid afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening rain. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my 10-year-old sedan. The car started with a sputtering cough, vibrating wildly before settling into a rough, familiar idle. I backed out of the driveway, taking one last look at the house. It looked just like all the others on the street, gray, lifeless, and hiding a tragedy. I didn't drive to the city. I drove out toward the county line. I drove until the pavement ended and turned into packed gravel. The tires crunched loudly, kicking up a trail of fine white dust that hung in the air behind me. I rolled the window down. The smell of the city exhaust and hot asphalt faded, replaced by the rich, loamy scent of turned earth and damp alfalfa. It was a smell that settled deep into the lungs, grounding and ancient. I pulled up to the edge of the home place. Wyatt's old farmhouse sat on a small rise, surrounded by massive, ancient oak trees. It was dilapidated. The porch roof sagged dangerously. The white paint was peeling in long, ugly strips, and the front windows were caked in decades of grime. But it was standing. And thanks to the state trust, it would keep standing until it rotted back into the earth naturally. I parked the car and walked out into the nearest field. The dirt was soft, yielding under my worn dress shoes. I bent down and picked up a handful of soil. It was dark, crumbly, and cool to the touch. I crushed it between my fingers, feeling the coarse sand and the smooth clay. I thought about Bradley, trapped in his sterile subdivision, suffocating under a mountain of bank loans and broken promises. I felt a tight knot in my chest, a father's grief for a son lost to his own hunger. I had punished him, brutally and finally. But the dirt in my hand didn't feel like a trophy. It just felt like dirt. The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass at the edge of the property, a low, sweeping whisper. The sky finally cracked open, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting my shoulders, soaking into my cheap suit, washing the dust from my hands, and sinking deep into the silent, unforgiving ground. If you found yourself gripped by this story of bitter justice and the heavy price of family betrayal, please leave a like. Stories like Harrison's remind us that the dirt always keeps its secrets, and greed has a way of digging its own grave. Share this video with someone who appreciates a slow, satisfying revenge, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more raw, grounded tales of human nature. Hit that bell icon so you never miss out.